Previously on our shed build series, we framed the roof and sheathed the walls. This week we're going to be installing the trim and siding, but before we can get to that, we have some preparing to do. For our loyal viewers who have been following along with our whole build, we wanted to be as thorough as possible when it comes to covering our steps. But if you'd rather get straight to siding, feel free to use the chapter markers to jump ahead. We first had to finish sealing up our structure by caulking some joints in the sheathing and adding a screen to the bottom of the building to prevent critters from setting up shop underneath the shed. Then we were ready to install our window. One of the most important things to consider when installing a window is the potential for water to enter the building, since the window opening is essentially a giant hole in an otherwise tightly sealed structure. We started by installing flashing tape to the bottom sill of the window opening and ran it a few inches up the sides. This protects the framing wood from water damage should water make its way to it. In order to mitigate thermal leakage, we'll be spray foaming any gaps between the window and the opening on the inside of the shed later. Then we added sealant to the top and side edges of the opening. You can also add this sealant to the nailing flange of the window itself, but we found it easier to apply it directly to the sheathing. It is important not to apply the sealant to the bottom edge of the opening. The idea here is that if water ever makes its way in behind the window flange, you want to maintain a path for it to travel freely out of the opening through the bottom. If you seal up the bottom edge, you will essentially be trapping the water inside the opening, which is a perfect recipe for mold and wood rot. Installing a window on new construction like this is really easy. It just slips into the opening and gets nailed or screwed into the building using the nailing flange, which is just a little flap along the edges that will rest up against the sheathing. Once the window is installed, we added flashing over the nailing flange, starting with the sides first and then the top, again leaving the bottom unsealed. You want to do the top last so that the seams in the tape are working to your advantage with regards to water flow, and there's no chance of moisture getting in underneath the seams of the tape. Then it was finally time for trim. I routed out a little channel on my trim pieces to accommodate for the screw heads and nailing flange of the window, so that the trim sits nice and flush on the sheathing. At the corners, I just marked where the rafter tail will meet the trim board and cut out a notch accordingly. I realized with the first corner that it was a little tricky to get both pieces to come together perfectly because of subtle irregularities in the building, so moving forward I decided to join the pieces together in the shop so I could ensure a nice and crisp 90-degree corner independent of the building's irregularities, and then install it all as one piece. For the front and back gable, I cut out notches in the trim pieces to make room for the stretchers that hold up the overhang. And once all the trim pieces were installed, I went ahead and painted them. Doing this before installing the siding just made it easier for me to spray on the paint without worrying about overspray on the siding or having to paint all the trim by hand. We went with an engineered composite siding by LP SmartSide. It's about an 8-inch wide lap siding with a faux wood-like texture on the front. The back looks like OSB. The product comes in 16-foot links, which allowed us to use solid runs on the long wall of the shed, avoiding any seams. It is pre-primed, which saves us a step when we're ready to paint, and the boards are treated, making it termite resistant and ensuring it lasts longer in the elements. It's also lightweight, so it was very easy to handle, and since it's a wood product, it cut easily with all of my regular woodworking tools. With lap siding, you want to start at the bottom and work your way up. Firstly, I used some leftover bits of trim to create a sort of shimming block below the sheathing to support the first row, since this row will hang below where the sheathing ends. This shimming block sits slightly proud of the sheathing, which will kick this first row of siding out a bit at the bottom, creating a slight angle to help pitch falling water away from the foundation blocks. We used a cut-off piece of the siding to mark a top line all the way across the wall to ensure our first row starts level. Since the boards are so lightweight and thin, it was easy to stack them up and cut a few at a time. The manufacturer recommends adding primer to any cuts since cutting the boards exposes untreated areas, so we sprayed some primer on all of our cuts. To help make the installation easier, we use these gecko gauge clamps that clamp onto a run of siding and help support the next row of siding while also setting a consistent reveal between rows. The spacing is adjustable so you can have a wide or more narrow reveal depending on the look you're going for. We also added spacers at the start and end of each course of siding to create an expansion gap that we will fill with caulk later. We had to buy a special siding nailer since our framing nailer is too powerful and would tear apart the siding. Obviously, you want to make sure you're nailing into the studs. The gecko clamps are not exactly cheap, but they saved us a ton of time, and once you get into the groove of laying these boards down, it starts to move pretty quickly. What did slow us down a bit was any obstacle in the wall that we had to cut around, but since the boards are so thin, cutting out openings was pretty easy. On either side of the door, we're going to be installing exterior sconces, so I just made a couple of mounting blocks out of some scrap wood that we installed onto the sheathing, and then cut an opening in the siding to accommodate the mounting blocks. For pipes and conduits, we just use the spade bit to cut out holes where needed. And for the peak at the gable, I just made a template out of some scrap siding that I cut to an angle that follows the pitch of our roof, and used that to make the little triangular bits that make up the peak. For the top row along the side walls of the shed, I had to first rip the board down to size and then cut notches out for each rafter tail. This was time consuming, but easy enough to figure out. To fill in whatever larger gaps were left at the top row, we added these foam backer rods and some caulk. We also caulked our expansion gaps along the ends where the siding meets the trim. Then we masked off the trim and any openings so we could spray on some paint. The overall structure of the shed matches the look of our house nicely, but I do want it to feel separate from the house and not like a detached garage or an ADU that is part of the main building in some way, so I decided to go with a very dark paint color. This will also importantly help push the shed back visually so that it doesn't stand out too much in the yard and become too much of a focal point. I've also always wanted to paint a house a super dark color, so this project let me get that out of my system. Next up, as promised, we're going to be finishing the roof, so stay tuned to our channel for that next upload.